Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to our next episode of Interview with an Exorcist. I'm here with my greatest teacher and my greatest pupil, Dr. Douglas Gabriel, and we've had the good fortune of having an anthroposophic friendship that spans back into the 1970s. So you get to hear it from the gray-headed ones. Some of our adventures. We're going to take off in this episode from what Douglas told me. It's going to really start off with his entry into the greater Detroit area. And so going to love this because then I get into the picture at that point. Douglas, how are you?
I am doing very well, John, so that I can even show up here and be on camera with you. And you're looking good.
Feel good.
Yeah, it's amazing. A couple old men like us still kicking. Yeah, it's pretty impressive. And yes, it's the era of Detroit we're talking about. And somehow this interview with the Exorcist has turned into also my biography. So it saves me having to write an autobiography. It's a video biography, I guess. And because I would never do my biography before, because if I told you the story of my life, you'd shake your head and say, that's not possible. Why are you lying to me? And so, therefore, I need a witness. And John Barnwell was there to witness it from the time of Detroit on. But, meeting John in Detroit was a very strange scenario because the first thing I did when I came into any town, so I had already lived in Detroit for a little while, helping get together the Waldorf Institute bookstore, and then getting familiar with the Detroit Waldorf School. And then when I came back the second time, I knew I was going to live there and do a degree in education. And the first thing I do when I go to a new town is I look up the co-op and look on its bulletin board, and that's where you find all the alternative stuff. And you go to the best bookshop around. You ask if there's a spiritual bookshop. And so I found out about the Mayflower Bookshop, where John worked for many years, in probably the first week I was in Detroit on a permanent basis. And those stories were in the prior discussions that we've had. But since we haven't had a chance to chat for a while, I'm going to give a real quick, brief summary, a recapitulation of the previous incarnations before my Detroit incarnation. And then we can basically, I want to talk about some principal people that I met, because that's probably the better way to do it than to try to go through it chronologically. Because some of these people are the most amazing people you'd ever want to meet. And I have somehow been privileged to run into them, probably because I had, radar. So I was always looking for the cool, interesting, smart, intelligent people. Plus, I had already gotten my degree in comparative religion. So my passion was alternative religion, and basically, if it was based upon the matriarchy or the worship of the goddess, all the better, because that's what I was focused on, proving that in all religions started off in their original condition in Aboriginal cultures as the ubiquitous triple goddess, the goddess of birth, death, and rebirth. Why? Because people looked at women and said, well, this is where we come from. It was simple as that. You didn't need to go any further with the question of, what's divine and what carries on and what is life. And so anyway, I was obsessed with all that. So by the time I came to Detroit, I was already doing some very, very unusual things, because I thought it was my mission to go into all these different groups, new spiritual groups, like Walden 2 communities down in Tecumseh, Missouri, or to the Camp Hill communities throughout America and Europe, or to, which was a Rudolf Steiner inspired community, to Waldorf schools, because around every Waldorf school, it's like an island of culture, and that's where you're going to find other Waldorf people. And so I traveled to Europe, and I traveled throughout America to look for a place for me to kind of settle down and to do my work. And basically, by the time I came to Detroit, I was more or less through with the Jesuits, because I was becoming more aware. And the more I traveled and the more I studied, the more aware I became that the Jesuits, they only tell you one part of the story when they brainwash you. And so came up as a Benedictine, and then I was a Trappist, and then I became a Jesuit because I was forced into it. And by spelling out the next 15 years of my personal development that I had sat down and written out, which happened to be the exact same thing as the inner teachings of the Manresa for Jesuits. So they asked me to move out of being a Trappist and go and be a Jesuit. And I said, well, that's okay, because I think I might want to be a teacher and a priest. And that's just, teaching at a university is what Jesuits usually do. So I went through and got different degrees and got, doctorate of divinity and blah, blah, blah. Moved through 3 of those, studied anthroposophy throughout the world, came back to do a degree in Detroit, in downtown Detroit. At that place, it was called the murder capital of America. At that time, that place, when I arrived there, man, I could tell you stories. We're not going to talk about the dark, but there was a lot of dark. And so I'm asking myself, why am I moving into the darkest of cities at this time to do spiritual work? Well, it was because I had met Werner Glass, and I'd met Hans Gebert and their wives, and Theo Bergen and Mariana Bergen and Rosemary Gebert and Barbara Glass, these 3 couples who founded the Waldorf School, and also Dr. Wilhelm and Amelia Wilhelm, the 4 couples really. They founded the Waldorf School, and they were smart enough to get the best teacher trainer, Werner Glass, to come there. And he got Theo Bergen and Mariana to come as teachers in the school, and he and Hans and their wives founded the Waldorf Institute. And that was in Indian Village. 3 streets in Indian Village come off of the main street that goes along the Detroit River. And for, 6, 8 blocks, it's mansions, really big houses. And John knows, he was in some of those mansions I lived in. But they weren't my mansions, but I did manage them. And so I came to the Institute, and they not only put me in charge of the bookstore, they put me in charge of the 14 properties that I was managing for these rich people who lived literally 3 doors down from the Institute. I handled all of the students coming in and out who needed a place to stay, because we had 14 properties. And so these people were always buying properties and real estate. So they introduced me into a whole other world, a world of materialism that was astounding, living with these people. I won't name them because it might insult them to be associated with me. But anyway, so, I lived in these mansions and managed other mansions that were turned into apartments for the students to live in. But at the same time, I came there after going to a special place I want to describe. John, you remember Stephen Gaskin and Monday Night Class and the Tennessee Farm, where they basically started midwifery in kind of a formal fashion down in Tennessee, right? And that I went there, I'd go there on a regular basis. I'd always pass through there. I became like a life member. Why? Because they were doing one of the coolest things at that time, and it was before I came to Detroit, that I encountered the farm people, we'll call them. And I only laugh because literally you could tell who these people were by looking at them, because their eyes bulge. They look like this. And you're going, well, are you from the farm? How did you know? Because you eat too much soybeans and it's too hard on your tummy, and it causes your eyes to protrude, which they finally found out after years and years of the people at the farm living on mostly soybeans and its derivatives, tofu and all this stuff. But they had the best, coolest thing going, which I was into, which is like the goddess kind of thing, where they said to any girl that was pregnant, don't abort the baby, come here, have the baby natural, in a place with no electricity, by the way. And they made this work back in the 70s. I think they moved there in 70. And for years, they took in anybody who came. The woman could have the baby there, and they made him a promise. We'll take care of your baby until you want to come back and get the baby. And then you can have the baby back if you want. And what an amazing thing. I thought that was the coolest thing that I'd ever encountered in my whole life. So I went there, worked with them a number of times, learned about midwifery, and learned and started incorporating some Waldorf ideas later with Ina May, and knew the Gaskins and really got connected to that community. So by the time I came to Detroit, there were already 2 health food restaurants founded by people from the farm. And I immediately became friends with them. So I'm into the whole, signed up in the co-op, started doing the alternative stuff. I was a Sufi dance leader. Oh, I haven't mentioned that, have I? Yeah, I got obsessed with Sufi dancing, right? Completely obsessed with Sufi dancing. Why? Because as an exorcist, nothing's more beautiful than watching the spirit incarnate into a group of people all singing and dancing happily together. Hippies or not, it didn't require being a hippie to be a Sufi dance person, because you don't have to know this from the first time you do it. You can learn how to do it very simple, and it is a religious experience. So I would teach Sufi dancing. So John knows this. When we started, I think I had a group of 200 people in 2 circles, concentric circles, when we were in Clarkston, and doing the what was that, harmonic convergence, which later, after that festival, turned into the Renaissance Festival. So John and I actually started the Renaissance Festival in Michigan. He was a sheriff, I was a sheriff, and it was the second year after we did this. And we always Sufi dance, right?
Well, and keep in mind, if you go back to the Bible, it tells about how King David danced before the Lord. And so there's this whole idea of the sacred dance, that it's an act of community consecration, that you're all agreeing that you are committing yourself to that which is the good, the true, and the beautiful.
That's so exactly it. And I played guitar from the time I was 11, and the 4 chords I know. John is a great guitar player, so that's why it's such a joke for me to say I play the guitar. But so I could play guitar, the drums, and that was what was used for Sufi dancing, right? But I didn't need that. We just sang, and we had taught them the simplest songs. And the great thing about Sufi dancing is this: for an exorcist, what was my deal with going to church? My deal with going to church wasn't the dogma and the doctrine, because usually the people in the church don't know the doctrine and the dogma. they're just followers. Mine was to find spiritual people doing spiritual things and calling down the spirit. And Sufi dancing is taking, usually you do the opening toward the song, which I could sing a dance with you now. I'd love to, if I could. Matter of fact, when we started off with these talking head video things, I said, no, I need to be up and moving around and have a blackboard, and then need to get the people up and dancing, right? You know how I used to do. I always had people in movement, and because that's how they learned. But anyway, the Sufi dance connection was very powerful. So as soon as I came to Detroit, I connected with the Sufi group. Now, at that time, for instance, right after our last interview, John, because I knew we were going to talk next about this topic, I wrote down some of the major teachers I've had in Detroit. This list of 50 over there, and then this list of 30 are the different groups that I joined that I was deeply connected to, each one of which we could have an entire session on. Certainly any of these groups, and because you were in a bunch of these, and the people, you knew a bunch of those people. And these, how fortunate I was. I had come out of a Catholic background, and I'd been in Kansas City and in Denver and in St. Louis, and then traveled around to anthroposophic communities. But I hadn't been to a city that was so open to alternatives on such a level. And like I've said before, I don't quite understand the spiritual ramifications of this, except Detroit sits on a gigantic underground salt mine. And so therefore there must have been some kind of salt water sitting here for a long time. So that might have some effect on it.
Well, yeah, and you can't forget the largest freshwater lakes that surround Michigan. And so you have this kind of polarity between the fresh water and then the underground salt. And Michigan used to be a great sea. And then when the sea receded and the ice age did all of its work, you end up in north of Detroit in Oakland County, that you have all these lakes that are remnants from that. And they actually have sand because it used to be an ocean. It's not like the lakes in Minnesota where it's like all muck on the bottom, but it's actually like sand. And so there's these beautiful lakes. And so this is really a wonderful place to come if you understand, because it's a nice place to live, but I wouldn't want to visit here because if you don't know what you're doing, you don't know where to go. But keeping that in mind, also that Detroit became a hub of spiritual groups, and which I think that the Mayflower Bookshop that I managed for many years was a big part of that. But there had already been quite a bit of activity, actually, since the 1920s in and around Detroit with various different spiritual groups. Some of them even have elaborate headquarters. And there's some amazing buildings that nobody ever gets to see. But in light of that, it became so central that eventually the headquarters of the Anthroposophical Society was moved to nearby Ann Arbor. And so that speaks volumes for the activity that was able to be generated through the efforts of Douglas and Verneglas and Hans Gebert and all those individuals you mentioned earlier.
Yes, it's a hub of foaming spiritual activity. And then when I got here, I was like just shocked. The people I worked for gave me a vehicle. They always had extra vehicles, so I always could drive around. So I worked for them and worked for the Institute, the Waldorf Institute in the bookstore, worked for the Detroit Waldorf School as like whatever low down job they wouldn't give anyone else. I just had to get my way in, get my foot in the door. So I started working for the Detroit Waldorf School, and I was still working as a Jesuit because I was now an associate and off doing a mission. Supposedly, though I wasn't connected with them much because I didn't like the Jesuit house and I didn't like the church there, and because the people were not good people. So here I am in Detroit, and right down the street every Sunday, I'd go down to the Hare Krishna house, which was beyond a house. It was a mansion on the Detroit River that used to be owned by the Fisher brothers, I guess. And it is beyond words. I could spend an hour describing it to you, but it was amazing. Totally, totally amazing. And so I'd go down there and chant with them and eat prasadam, which is their holy food offered up to the gods. Had a lot of sugar in it, so I really, had a good time because I'd be going to churches every single Sunday, okay? So then I'd go down to the Detroit Institute of Arts and go to the Paramahasa Yogananda Self-Realization Fellowship meeting with Mr. Black, and we'd all sing and be happy. And I'd just been dancing and was happy with the Krishnas, and I'd go downtown and sing and be happy. Then I'd go to, earlier I would have gone probably to St. Joseph to where they still did the Latin Mass, because I was a altar boy during the Latin Mass, and I liked the Latin Mass. And so I would go to a church here in Detroit, and there were so many churches in Detroit and so diverse. So I'd go to St. Joe's, and then later, if I wanted to, I'd go over to Sacred Heart or go down to where the bishop, the archbishop, and now the cardinal were down at their place. Or I could go to the anthroposophic meetings that would happen. But eventually, I found out that there was a Christian community church that once a month had Christian community Eucharist, basically, at the Detroit Waldorf School. So I became an altar boy for them. So here I am, being an altar boy in Rudolf Steiner's Act of Consecration of Man, it's called. Terrible name for nowadays, but it's the Holy Eucharist. He renewed the 7 sacraments. And I had already written my entire own religion when I had become a universal life minister. in Missouri when I got out of the military. As soon as I got out and I was being a Trappist, I was working with all these communities. And to make myself kind of official, something they could understand, I became Universal Life Minister, a Doctor of Divinity through them, and I created my own religion with my own creed, my own beliefs. What greater pride or hubris could a Leo have than to say, to be asked by Universal Life Ministry, would you like to write your own doctrine and dogma and your own religious ceremonies? I went, yes. So I wrote one, and later they used it, and they would give it out to people for free as a model of what you could do. So I wrote a creed and the whole thing, and I was totally, tripping out because I had to marry. I wanted to marry people because that's when the big festivals happened, and when I could do Sufi dancing. So I'd marry them, do Sufi dancing, and do a sweat lodge because I was also trained in sweat lodges, right? So before I ever came to Detroit, I was a completely ridiculous person involved in, studying the Book of Urantia, the Book of Oahspe, the Edgar Cayce stuff, all the Theosophy stuff, the Steiner stuff, biodynamics, with the lady who was one of the two major biodynamic people in America, Rosina Arendt, and with Josephine Porter, the number one person. And so I was studying biodynamics, and while I was still in the military, I was, connected to crazy things. But I'd have to travel all over, to meet people who had the library like Ellen had down in Wilmington that I've told you about before, the Aquarian Foundation or the Summit Lighthouse group or all those things. So every time I come across one of these groups, I was thrilled. I'd stay up all night long reading the books or watching whatever it took to understand them so that I could enter in. And here's the way it always went. And this is what I think we probably concluded by telling my biography up to this point. Every time I go to one of these groups, because I was so interested, they thought I was really cool. And they'd promote me. They'd put me in charge. They'd say, no, here's the reins. Nobody else is doing it. You do it. Here you go. And I'd go, I don't want the reins and I don't want any. No, I'm just studying this. I'm just an honest student. And then eventually they'd kick me out because I'd asked too many questions, right? And they didn't have the answers. And it's embarrassing. So I would figure out the limit of that envelope of spiritual study, and then I'd go to the next one. And so I was kind of like I don't remember which great spiritual teacher told me this, but after 2 days of me questioning them, they looked at me and they said, has anyone ever told you that talking to you is like having an Electrolux vacuum cleaner stuck into your ear and suck all your brains out? And I said, no one's ever told me that, but you know what? That's pretty much what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to get from you everything you have to give to me so I can give to the ones who are coming after me. And so I'd go to all these spiritual people, as I've told you before. But when I came to Detroit, I was already doing Sufi dancing. So I'd go to the Sufi Center. And then right down the street was the Capuchin Monastery, the soup kitchen, which of course I had to go work in the soup kitchen. And that's where Father Solanus was, which we've talked about extensively. But in Father Solanus's office spaces, or where he worked, that's where the Holy Order of Man had a church. And they used this room as a chapel. And who did I meet there, John? Your dear friend, Ariel, and her husband at the time, William, or spiritual husband at the time. He was the head of the Holy Order of Man in Detroit. And she is a Sufi dance par excellence, and all kinds of other spiritual paths. So there at the Holy Order of Man, I'm with these beautiful people, okay? All the people of the Holy Order of Man were beautiful people. They were humble people. They literally went out on the streets and helped people. It was like, who else is doing this kind of work? And so then from that time on, I followed after, William and Ariel, when they went to Oakland, and then when they went to Hawaii, and then she got with Aravinda, and then I'd follow them. Whatever they were doing, I'd try to chase this person, Ariel, but she was always way faster, and she kind of treated me like her younger brother, who she'd have to always tell what to do and to scold me for getting off the path, which I was always getting off the path. There's a lot of nice things. See this path behind me? Look at all that. You could get off on the path. And so I'd met her, and then I met I want you to say something about Ariel in a second, but listen to this. I realized this in the interim between our talks. I met Faith Foster immediately, one of the greatest mezzo-soprano singers who ever lived. She sounded exactly like Elizabeth Schwarzkopf. She had numerous recordings. She had groups that were founded on just supporting her being the lead singer for chamber groups. She had numerous pieces of music written for her, and at one time someone wrote her a symphony, and she sang with the Detroit Symphony. She sang in the opera. She sang, but her voice, I don't know, John, do you think anyone ever listened to Faith sing a beautiful classic song that didn't fall in love with her voice?
Oh, she was incredible. I remember one time going to where she was doing just singing with her and a pianist, and she was doing some pieces by Claude Debussy, and like that one, I hear a wind from another planet. Is the way it translates. She was a lot of fun, and just really a will person. I mean, she if you needed to get something done, if she couldn't do it, she knew somebody that could. She was just amazing, and you got to live in her home for a period of time.
I was always trying to live in that big mansion of hers out in Grosse Pointe, because she was my Grosse Pointe contact. And she introduced me to the strangest people and the coolest people, the richest people, the most talented people. Oh my gosh, she knew everyone. It used to be in the old days, I'd say, I would hang out with Robert Thibodeau, the owner of the Mayflower Bookshop, who you worked with for many years. And he's still a good buddy. He was one of the founding members of the Manassa Club. And if I was with one of them, couldn't go anywhere where someone didn't know them. Not possible. Wherever we ended up, whoever was in charge knew either Robert or Faith. It depends which group I was in. If Robert was in all the alternative groups and astrology. But Faith had beyond, her memory was astounding. She was no limit to how she memorized every single poem she ever sang, and she sang every great classic song there ever was for a mezzo soprano. And then everything else. And she sang religious music. So every Sunday we would go to, usually she was singing at some great church, some fantastic thing somewhere, wherever the best music was, she was the lead in that choir for Sunday music. But then we would also, she showed me how to become an usher. So I would go into the music hall or the Ford Auditorium, or I'd go to wherever the best music was, be an usher, and get to hear it for free. And sit wherever we wanted once the people were seated. It was like, well, why does no one know that you can do this? And so she showed me all these tricks of life, and she was much older than me. And it's really strange, because the first time I ever came to her house, I came with one of her music students so I could get music lessons, because I was going to be in some performance or whatever. So she remembers afterwards, she says to me, once we were best friends for many, many years, for decades, she says, Dougie, the first time I met you, I thought you were an arrogant asshole. And then I thought, wait a second, don't say that. You may have to work for that little mother sometime in the future. And she ended up working for me for decades in schools that I was managing, right? So she was correct about that. But she introduced me to some of the strangest people you've ever seen, people who I can't even begin to describe them, even remembering that they exist, like Stephen Hume, who ran for mayor over and over again just to agitate the mayor because he knew it was rigged. He would do stunts. He would do stunts that would get on the news all the time, because there was a bicycle race every year. So every year, he would wait till they got started, and they'd try to keep him out. And then he'd get on a bike that would have literally a jetpack on the back, or, somehow he would win the race, but win it illegally so that people would notice him. He ended up living in a gigantic ship that was in a sluice that was on the Detroit River, where all the railroad trains came down with. So he ended up having the biggest boatyard you've ever seen in your life. That's where he lived. And he lived on one of these gigantic boats. But that was Faith's boyfriend. Okay. But then on the other hand, she'd get me into any performance. We could walk in the back door because they thought she was performing, and she'd just take me because I was carrying her. I don't know. I was the person just serving her. So we could get into anywhere. So I got exposed to the highest level of culture, being a total hillbilly from the Ozarks, right? To the lowest level of culture, but on the alternative level. I got introduced to through Ariel through the highest spiritual stuff going on, through everything. She was involved in anything spiritual. She'd end up being there to open it up with some Sufi dancing or something. And then I got introduced to the total materialism through the McCarthys, and I got introduced then to the rest of the world through the Mayflower Bookshop. And that's because the Mayflower Bookshop, anyone who was anyone at that time that was a student of the Western esoteric tradition that didn't know the Mayflower Bookshop, well, then you know they hadn't done their homework.
Yeah, well, we were the largest esoteric, metaphysical, holistic, alternative, history of ideas. I mean, on and on and on and on. I mean, according to Donald Weiser, and everybody thought he was the biggest. And when he came to visit with his wife from Weiser's in New York, he came in when we were still on Woodward, and he said, you know, you guys have twice the stuff I have, and they tell me I'm the biggest in the world, but so obviously you are. And then we moved into Berkeley to its current location and added we doubled the inventory over there, so that we were the largest esoteric bookstore in the world. And I found out only in the last couple of years that we sold more Steiner books than anybody on earth, which I thought, well, that doesn't surprise me, because it'd be difficult for me to at least not show somebody, you know, oh, you might like this. And I didn't pressure anybody. I would just put it before them. And if it happened to move them, I pulled a lot of people out of the pursuit of dark figures like Aleister Crowley and whatnot into Rudolf Steiner's work. So it was like, I feel like I was on a certain level saving souls from Mammon, you know, the dark forces of the adversary that have grabbed such a stranglehold in so much of modern culture that is exalting that which has fallen.
It was the best, even when it was in Ferndale, there on Woodward. Matter of fact, that is, I think, the original place that I met Ariel. Now, I met you there, but I'd gone there every Saturday to try to get through the layers of books at the Mayflower when it was on Woodward. And every time I was there, I would meet some amazing person. Every single time, beyond a shadow of a doubt. Strangely enough, I went there many times and would get into debates with Robert Thibodeau, Bob Thibodeau, we called him at that time. And, you know, because I'd been there years before selling him crystals and I knew of the place. So I went there, you know, to check out the books because, you know, I couldn't afford all those books. So I would go there and study. That's what it was used for. It was used like a temple of wisdom or a library of wisdom or something. So I'd go there. Then finally, Robert says to me, he'd call me the anthroposophic kid. He'd say, okay, kid, get your smartest guy. So I got Brian Lynch. We're going to meet and we're going to have a discussion. So we go to Robert's house. He gets, what was the guy who played the guitar so well?
Ted Lucas, he was a student of Ravi Shankar like 5 years before the Beatles.
Yeah, and he was experiencing all kinds of things, and he was, you know, kind of a crack brain fire philosopher like us. So he gets him, and Bob wanted to sit down and iron out the difference between theosophy and anthroposophy, or in other words, what he had been taught in theosophy to dislike about anthroposophy. And so eventually we had, with your help, late Ted got out, you got in. And the first time I met you, I saw a vision of being a Templar knight uh, in uh, in France, and you were standing right next to me, and you were wearing some big old French hat. But at the time, you happened to be wearing a funny looking jean jacket patch hat, and I don't know, I went nuts. I grabbed your hat, threw it on the ground, started jumping up and down on it, saying, "That is the ugliest hat." Now, this is the first time I met John. So I'm jumping up and down on his hat after ripping it off his head. After he's been brought in, and where Brian's very expensive rich house, and Bob and John are there to defend theosophy, and Brian Lynch and myself are there to defend anthroposophy. After that, we became the Monastic Club and worked for many, many years and merged with what was called the Romantic Futurists. Why don't you tell them about the Romantic Futurists?
Well, yeah, the Romantic Futurists was a group of artists, poets, musicians, singers, and we called ourselves that kind of after the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, kind of the idea that the mission of art, that art can lead culture into a healthy domain. And it's interesting because we do poetry readings at different places. In fact, we did a poetry reading at the Fisher Mansion, who before he sold it to the Krishna people, it belonged to a very dear friend of mine who's deceased a few years ago, but that's a whole another story. But that is the most fabulous house. I mean,
Oh, yeah.
it had like gold braids in between the tiles on the floor in the library where we would do the poetry reading. And so we do all these things, and at the natural food restaurants, and we'd also have events where we'd bring in people from Findhorn Gardens in Scotland, David Spangler and Malenko and Kathy Matanovic, and we brought in Peter Caddy, one of the original founders, and Eileen, who was the one who talked to the nature spirits, so they were just a whole constellation of people. But it's so fascinating that when I finally met Douglas and Brian, I felt as if I finally found some people that I could connect the dots that I'd been pursuing, because if you study theosophy, they give you a great many pieces. And actually, in studying Rudolf Steiner's work, you're at an advantage if you have put some theosophy under your belt before you study him, because a lot of his early lectures that he did were to the Theosophical Society, and he's using theosophical terminology, and it's in reference to the cosmogenesis and anthropogenesis of Blavatsky's secret doctrine, and the certain Rosicrucian connection to Isis unveiled. So it's all interwoven together, but it has to do with it's said that the masters of wisdom and the harmonization of sensations and feelings bring in new impulses around the last 25 years of a century. And so I came into the Mayflower around 1975, and then soon after started working there, and all these people started constellating, and there were so many people that came for Waldorf training, but also had previously owned esoteric bookstores in other areas of the country, and they'd end up joining our monastic club, and so we had all these interesting people that were very widely read, but it's not enough to be widely read, but to be able to be deep. And that was what I found in Rudolf Steiner's work, is the depth.
Yeah, those were the days. Man, did we have energy. We created with Colleen, Bob's wife, we created in the Monastic Club, we created our own Masonic lodge that would try to undo the mistakes of, previous lodges. and so many other things. But through the Mayflower, basically, I got connected to the whole world. And every summer, because I was a teacher, they would call me the scout. Okay, scout, we figured this out during the year. This really cool person we want to come here. You need to go and get them and bring them, make sure they come back. Because the Romantic Futurists were bankrolled by Robert and the Mayflower. And so he would say, yeah, I'll pay for you to come in, and then I'll hold a conference, and then, you'll make some money, you'll do some readings, and everybody makes money, and so blah, blah, blah. So we could get anybody we wanted, literally.
Yeah, I misspoke. I said Eileen, but it was actually Dorothy McLean.
Oh,
She was
Dorothy. Sure, of
Dorothy.
course.
She was wonderful. She lived in Canada afterwards, but what a marvelous! She reminded me of Ariel. It's like she could have been like Ariel's grandmother or something. I mean, she had that same
Totally.
kind of vibe.
That is so true. And I brought her to Hawaii, and then I introduced her to the elementals on Hawaii. She was so blown away because they're like, 27 feet tall. The Hawaiian elementals are just insane. No wonder, they use kapu'u and
Well, I met Ariel when she was. I was at a friend's house. His girlfriend was one of her stepsisters, and we're standing in the living room, and this little girl runs in. She must have been, I don't know, 9 or 10, and grabs a cookie out of the cookie jar and runs outside. And so, and that was Ariel.
yeah.
In her previous incarnation as Robin, and then I ended up meeting her years later and introducing her to a lot of these people that she was unaware of. But she was a trained ballerina, and most people don't know that. And so it was just a natural fit for her to get into Sufi dancing.
Oh, she was trained in Katak. She was trained with the whirling dervishes. When I say I was a Sufi dance, I'm with Sufi Sam, his gang, and Toward the One, The Perfection of Love, Harmony, and Beauty.
Yeah,
That whole thing.
Samuel Lewis. I spent some time with one of his principal students in the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, a really tall guy you see in the movie Sunseed. That guy was bizarre, to say the least. But Sufi Sam was interesting because he was a Sufi. He was also a rabbi, and he was also an Orthodox priest. He was trained in all those, and he was an enlightened being. And I don't know anybody that is an enlightened being that wouldn't say, yeah, Sufi Sam was an enlightened being. And somebody once asked him, because he said he was going to be passing away soon, and they said, well, what are we going to do? He says, well, I'll appoint a successor. Well, how are you going to appoint a successor? How will you know? He says, how will I know? I'll see the radiance that surrounds them. but he was good friends with Brother Paul, who started the Holy Order of Man, and they had their own Holy Order of Man tarot deck, and it was in black and white, and you color it in as a meditative tool, which I have a strong affinity. As people know, my books are based on the 22 Arcanum approach of the tarot and Kabbalah and all of that. But I want to hear Douglas's story, not mine.
Well, Pierre Valai, you were initiated by Pierre Valai. And Ariel would sit on Pierre Valai's lap. Later, she'd sit on Pope John Paul's lap, go into his own room, which women aren't allowed to go in there, and get him into Mary studies and into anthroposophy, because later he was a big favorite a fan of Meditations on the Troll by Anonymous, which is actually Valentin Tomberg, who got a good part of his stuff from Rudolf Steiner. So Ariel she knew Sufi Sam, she knew Pierre Valai in the family from the inside out, and she was with the Sufis that were across the Golden Gate Bridge in Marin, and I went there, and man, those are Mevlevi swirling dervishes from the Transcaucasian. That is not the American Sufi dancing that Sufi Sam taught, which is universalism. So you take the 7 universal religions and you do a song and a dance from each of them. And you're not complete. The circle isn't done until you started off with Toward the One, this song that every true Sufi circle starts with. And then it becomes 7 in whatever order the people who are leading it want to do. So you recognize the 7 world religions, and then you close with something. So it's actually a holy Eucharist based upon dance, like Peter Dunov did in Bulgaria, right? I think it was Bulgaria. Anyway, he and then Steiner did with eurythmy, but on stage and very, very stylistic. And then you have Gurdjieff, who said he got his eurythmy, or what do you call it, eurythmics, eurythmics. He said he got that from the Trans-Caucasian masters, which is where the Sufis got their teaching. So a Sufi is not particularly Islamic, though Islam was usually one of the 7 religions that are considered traditional that are used in a normal Sufi dance presentation, which is really a holy Eucharist. So for me, I just went from the altar to open field. And best if I got to, I always liked doing marriages and particularly sweat lodges because I'm American Indian. So I was into all these different bizarre things, and I come here and then it's like, oh my gosh, now I have a smorgasbord. I don't have enough time to go to the downtown Detroit AMORC, which is that's a form of Rosicrucianism, or to the Max Heindels group, or to Unity Church, or to the Church of Today. So, late at one point, the Romantic Futurists brought Marianne Williams here. I remember when we were sitting, we saw her on TV, and I turned to Bob and say, we have to get her here. And within the year, she was in Detroit and actually moved her residence to Grosse Pointe to work in Detroit. Or Lynn Andrews came here to see us repeatedly at the Mayflower because we didn't know it, but we were being used as the inspiration for her books. So, I was used as, the 1 year I worked at the Mayflower, that is when I helped Kathleen Kennedy start the Indiana Jones series. And then for 5 shows, those were ideas that came from me through the Mayflower Bookshop. Before that, the bookshop that I worked for, the Waldorf Institute, that's where Poltergeist, I'm working at the bookshop, I'm answering questions on the phone. Poltergeist came through Kathleen Kennedy, through that bookshop, through me, and what was the other thing? Oh, and then I'm working there, and one day, Marcia Lucas, my boss, says, come in here, meet with this woman. I have to meet with her for 3 days and rewrite Star Wars. And so all because I'm working in a bookstore, right? Bookstores in those days were better than, it was the internet, but it was better than the internet. And then what did you do? You would, if you had nothing to do, if you wanted to, really go on a spiritual journey, you'd have to go get the books for it. And Robert and John literally sold more anthroposophic books than the Anthroposophic Press itself. But more than that, they turned thousands of people onto Steiner. And that is no exaggeration, thousands. Our monastic club was a group of 4 at first. And then it was, other people tried to get into it, but it was always the core of 4. And then I merged the Detroit Anthroposophic Study Group with it. And we had hundreds of people coming. And with the Romantic Futurists performances, hundreds of people would come. And sometimes we would just have conversations, or in the middle of it, we'd have kind of a stylized Goetheanistic conversation. And we recorded them, but we never did get them in print. But it was out of that then that so much of the work came. Robert and I ended up doing dozens of Wizards video self-help tapes. And John, and this is the whole point of today's talk, is John is the person who, even though I'd gone to the Mayflower, it never crossed my mind, even though I'd studied astrology, it never crossed my mind to be a reader, because I didn't even know what a reader was, right? So when I met John, he pulled out, I don't have one with me, which is rare because I usually have one. It's a card that shows the 52 cards in the deck, and then you look up your birthday, and then he gives you a reading with this just one piece of paper. And I'm like, holy God, what is that? I grab it from him and go, okay, teach me this system. And he goes, well, get this book and memorize them, and then come back, and then I'll work with you, because there's stages beyond this. The Mystic Test book, which John has worked out, I have not. I cannot work it out. He has shown me how it works. So you can do a layout with cards, your standard deck of cards, that will tell you practically every hour of the day what's going to happen that day. If you wish to get that detailed, I've sat there and watched him and some of his people, very deep students, Eugene Galerno and such, where they literally could tell you exactly what's going to happen by looking at the layout of the deck. So I'm going, okay, I have to. My beautiful production manager, who's also my boss, who's also my glorious wife, hands this to me. See that? Okay, it looks pretty simple, right? Yeah, and then on the back you look up dates, right? This is the handiest thing I've ever encountered in my entire life. I've now earned more money at being a reader using this little card, because at that time, starting after the time I met John, Robert would call me up and he'd say, "You're a good enough psychic reader. I need a psychic reader for fair, for a party, whatever. 100 $100 an hour or some ridiculous fee." Like, oh yeah, whatever. I'll be glad to be there. You tell me the time. But John taught me that system, and so I've been using that in a mix of everything else as a buffer, as so I wouldn't have to just be outright clairvoyant, because that's not so good. Giving people readings just being outright clairvoyant, not so good. But I've been using the tarot cards since I was 17. Still have the same exact deck. Never lost a single card, by the way. But John taught me this, and now I've taught it to my own, some of my own children, and they use it all the time, and it just blows them away. Because I meet somebody on the street and they go, "Do you mind if I ask you your birthday? Not the year," to let them know I'm not doing astrology, just the date. And they go, "Well, okay." And then they tell me that, and I tell them all about themselves, and then they're like completely blown away. So I literally have made money by doing mini readings with this. So John, I don't know what 10% of all the money I made from using this is, but that's probably what I owe you.
But just to give a little bit more detail, you brought up Pope John Paul II, who was a dear friend with our dear friend Ariel. And it's interesting to note, I have a friend who's one of the guitar players I used to jam with, when I go out and jam at these various clubs. But I go jam with Jim McCarty from the Rockets and Mitch Ryder and Detroit Wheels and all that. And this friend of ours would come in and jam with us, and he used to be an altar boy for Pope John Paul II. And I turned to him one time, I said, Pope John Paul studied Rudolf Steiner. He looked at me. He was freaked out. He goes, "He did? How did you know that?" And I told him, I have a picture of him, Pope John Paul, sitting at his desk, and he has the German edition of Valentin Tomberg's Meditations on the Tarot. It's a 2-volume edition. You can see it sitting there on his desk, and there's another picture of him holding it under his arm while he's waving to a crowd. And what people don't know is that he was very much into theater, and in Poland when he was a young man, and he was involved with starting what's called I can't tell you what it's called in Polish. I would just mask about theater rhapsodyczny, but it's the Rhapsodic Theater in Krakow, Poland. And he started it, he was a co-founder with Mieczysław Kotlarczyk, okay? And Mieczysław Kotlarczyk was a disciple of Rudolf Steiner's. And so his name was Karol Wojtyła at that time, Pope John Paul. And so he studied this when he was a young student, and he never really gave it up. In fact, my friend told him, yeah, he has Steiner books sitting on his nightstand, and, which is interesting. But he became the Archbishop of Krakow, and he wrote an introduction to a book, The Art of the Living Word, by Kotlarczyk, the disciple of Rudolf Steiner's. And it's interesting because Pope John Paul said, "My passion for theater was inspired by my instructor, Mieczysław Kotlarczyk. He was a true pioneer of amateur theater repertoire with great ambitions." And that from In Gift and Mystery by Pope John Paul II. But in getting him to understand that, he used to perform Rudolf Steiner's mystery dramas when he was a young man in Krakow, and that he was a very deep soul. And when you get into Hans Urs von Balthasar, who wrote the foreword to Tomberg's Meditations on the Tarot, it was Pope John Paul that elevated him into the status of a cardinal. And but it was like 7 years after he had written that foreword. And that being said, Tomberg is a bit of a departure, but it's in the mix. At one time, Tomberg was an anthroposophist. So the more you look at things, the more you find that people you didn't expect have been influenced in a very significant way by Rudolf Steiner, especially in theater.
Our dear, dear, dear friend, Michael McKibben, was very close with Pope John Paul II, and he allowed him to come into Poland and other places to sing behind the Iron Curtain when this was completely verboten, completely forbidden. And then later, the singing revolution literally is what brought down the Iron Curtain. Let's just be clear, it was not Ronald Reagan. It was Michael McKibben and Living Sound being the ones to put their lives on the line to go and do these things, and then others followed. And that singing revolution actually brought down the Iron Curtain. Think of that, folks. That's the kind of thing that happens. And the deal is, in the Mayflower Bookshop, I'd go in there just to hang out, just to see who'd come in. And my teachers, the top teachers, every top teacher who ever came to Detroit came to the Mayflower Bookshop. So John knows every one of them and helped guide them in their questions to the books that gave them their answers, from Norman Davidson to Carlo Pietzner to, oh my gosh, the list, I told you, there's 50 people on this list. Half of those are anthroposophists, the top in the world. They all came here. And Werner knew them all. And Werner was my real teacher that I was so close to. Basically what we did in Detroit, I don't think could be replicated anywhere else. And then if you look at the Great Lakes, as you pointed out, Chicago and Detroit, between the two, there's some kind of polarity, but people can see that the power and control oftentimes come from Chicago, and the inner depth comes from Detroit. And people come here, sometimes they go through all kinds of catharsis, but oftentimes they are somehow inspired by that catharsis. So some of the most spiritual people I ever met came out of Detroit. What is the likelihood of that being true? I could have gone anywhere. I was a Waldorf teacher. All the most beautiful places have rich people. And those rich people have children, and they want Waldorf schools. I could have gone anywhere. I ended up in Detroit, for heaven's sakes.
Well, one of the only modern canonized saints was Father Solanus Casey, who was based in Detroit. And so there's a really vital spiritual community within many, many different denominations. I mean, and different religions. And so it's that kind of eclecticism, and that was so friendly. And you mustn't think of it as blurring the edges, but that the Christ impulse, which we're attempting to understand in our 50-year conversation, Douglas and I, has to do with that which came for all mankind, and that's what Christ brought to all mankind. But his greatest gift will be that which people are willing to take up as a personal task for their own growth and development. And that being said, we don't want to go over long in these talks, even though I'm enjoying them more than anybody else, perhaps. But I'm sure in a few days we'll come up with the next episode. And I want to thank Tyler and Douglas Gabriel for making this and many other things possible. And for all the people that are out there, I want to thank you very much. And Douglas, bless you, my friend.
Thank you, and bless all of you.